When it comes to wild car ideas, General Motors has never been afraid to push the envelope, sometimes straight into the twilight zone of design. Over the decades, GM created machines that looked like jet fighters, household appliances, and even space pods on wheels. Some were brilliant, others baffling, and a few were downright embarrassing. But which ones really made jaws drop? Stick around, because these cars prove that GM's imagination could get just as weird as it was ambitious. 1953. GM Firebird IXP21. Imagine walking into an auto show in the early 1950s expecting chrome, fins, and tailpipes, and instead seeing what looks like a jet fighter on wheels. That was the Firebird I, GM's audacious attempt to bring aviation into the driveway. It didn't just look like a jet, it practically was one, complete with a bubble canopy and a tail fin that screamed Top Gun decades before Maverick ever took flight. But the real kicker? It wasn't powered by your typical V8. Nope, this monster ran on a gas turbine engine, the kind you'd expect to see strapped under a military jet. Engineers claimed it could produce 370 horsepower and send the car soaring past anything else on the road. Sounds awesome, right? Well, not so fast. The turbine guzzled fuel at an insane rate, ran hotter than a blast furnace, and was almost impossible to tame for everyday driving. One test driver nearly lost control, just trying to shift gears. The Firebird wasn't meant for production. It was part of GM's Motorama Dream Car series, a flashy way to show off the company's engineering muscle. Still, the sight of a jet car with wheels rolling across the floor left an impression. GM would go on to make 3 more Firebirds, each crazier than the last. But the first remains the most shocking. It was equal parts genius and madness, a car that asked not, "Can we drive it?" but "Should we?" 1956. Buick Centurion. When most people think of 1950s cars, they picture pastel paint, chrome grills, and Elvis Presley on the radio. But the Buick Centurion looked like it rolled out of a science fiction movie set. Its most jaw-dropping feature? A full-glass bubble canopy, the kind you'd expect to see on a rocket ship, not a family car. Step inside, and you'd feel more like a test pilot than a suburban dad. And GM wasn't just messing around with looks here. The Centurion was packed with technology that sounded almost unbelievable for the time. The standout gimmick was its rear-mounted television camera, which fed video to a screen inside the car. In other words, Buick gave the world a backup camera, nearly 50 years before it became standard equipment. Let that sink in. The Centurion also sported dramatic red and white paint, flowing curves and space-age fins that seemed more suited for a Mars expedition than Main Street. It was bold, it was futuristic, and it was totally impractical. The glass canopy alone would have cooked passengers alive on a sunny day. Imagine being trapped inside a mobile greenhouse with no air conditioning. But that was the beauty of GM's Motorama era. These weren't cars built to sell. They were rolling experiments designed to capture attention and stir imaginations. The Centurion succeeded on that front. It predicted technology we take for granted today, while also reminding us that futuristic style often comes at a sweaty price. 1959 Cadillac Cyclone. By 1959, Cadillac had already mastered the art of outrageous fins and chrome. But the Cyclone took things to another galaxy. Inspired by the jet age, this sleek concept looked like something Captain Kirk would have parked outside the Starship Enterprise. With its bullet-shaped nose, canopy doors, and radar pods sticking out like antennae, the Cyclone screamed, "Tomorrow's car, today!" One of its most talked-about features was the radar crash avoidance system. Yes, you heard that right. Cadillac claimed this car could detect obstacles and prevent collisions decades before anyone had heard of modern driver assist technology. The radar sensors were housed in big black cones mounted on the front fenders. giving the car distinctly bug-eyed appearance. Cutting edge? Sure. Subtle? Not even close. Inside, the Cyclone continued the futuristic theme with silver upholstery, bucket seats, and controls that looked more like airplane instruments than anything in a showroom Cadillac. To get inside, the bubble canopy slid back electronically, enveloping you like you were stepping into a fighter jet. Cool? Absolutely. Practical? Not a chance. So why didn't the Cyclone make it to production? The radar system didn't really work. The canopy was a nightmare for comfort, and the styling was so radical that even Cadillac's wealthiest buyers probably would have raised an eyebrow. Still, the Cyclone remains one of GM's wildest attempts at predicting the future. It showed us a glimpse of self-driving dreams long before computers were in the driver's seat. 1959. GM Firebird III. If the first Firebird was crazy, by the time GM got to the third one, all bets were off. The Firebird III looked like something that had escaped from a futuristic comic book, a bizarre blend of rocket ship and insect. With 7 fins jutting out of its body, a twin bubble canopy, and a cockpit that looked like NASA Mission Control, this thing made heads spin. The Firebird III wasn't just weird to look at, it was weird to drive, too. Instead of a traditional steering wheel, GM equipped it with a joystick-like control system called Unicontrol. Imagine trying to guide a 225-horsepower gas turbine car with a stick that controlled steering, throttle, and braking all at once. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, and that's pretty much what it was. Under the skin, the Firebird III was loaded with technology that felt almost science fiction. It had cruise control, anti-lock brakes, air conditioning, and even automated guidance systems meant to work with electronic highways that didn't exist. GM clearly thought the year 2000 would look more like the Jetsons than reality. But for all its futuristic flair, the Firebird III was still more showpiece than road-ready machine. Nobody was going to daily drive this spaceship on wheels. What it did accomplish, however, was cement GM's reputation as the king of outrageous concept cars. If the goal was to leave people slack-jawed, Firebird III did the job better than most. 1961. Pontiac Tempest. Now let's bring things back down to earth with a car that was actually sold to the public, but in a way that left everyone scratching their heads. The 1961 Pontiac Tempest might look fairly normal on the outside, but under the skin, it was one of the strangest engineering experiments GM ever unleashed. The Tempest's party trick was its drivetrain. Instead of the usual setup, engineers mounted the transmission in the back of the car and connected it to the engine with a long, flexible drive shaft that curved like a bow. They called it the rope drive, and while it was clever, it was also prone to rattles, vibrations, and headaches for mechanics. To add to the weirdness, some Tempests came with a half-sized 4-cylinder engine that was literally one bank of Pontiac's big V8 chopped in half. It shook like a washing machine on spin cycle, but gave the car a quirky personality. Combine that with the rear transaxle, and you had a compact car that handled like nothing else on American roads. Critics loved the innovation, but buyers weren't so sure. The Tempest was too strange for mainstream tastes, and by 1964, Pontiac abandoned the rope drive experiment. Still, this oddball car earned a place in history as one of GM's boldest attempts to break the mold. It wasn't flashy like the Firebirds, but it was proof that weirdness sometimes hides in the details. 1963. Chevrolet Corvair Greenbrier camper. By the early 1960s, camping culture was booming, and Americans wanted adventure-ready vehicles. Volkswagen had its famous microbus, but GM wasn't about to let the Germans steal the show. Enter the Chevrolet Corvair Greenbrier camper, a van so strange it made people wonder whether GM engineers were actually serious or just bored in the design studio. Unlike most vans of the time, the Greenbrier had its engine in the rear, just like the Corvair sedan it was based on. That already gave it unusual proportions. But then GM decided to turn it into a full-blown camper. The result? A rolling contradiction. The Greenbrier camper packed in a fold-out bed, compact kitchenette, and storage for gear, but all in a van barely big enough to hold a family of 4 comfortably. Performance was another matter. With only 80 horsepower pushing a fully loaded van, the Greenbrier struggled to climb steep hills, especially when burdened with camping gear. And let's not forget the infamous Corvair handling quirks. Yes, this camper inherited the same swing-axle suspension that made Ralph Nader call the Corvair unsafe at any speed. Imagine barreling down a mountain road with your family, cookware rattling, and the rear end deciding it wants to lead the way. Still, there was something undeniably charming about the Greenbrier camper. It represented GM trying to tap into a growing counterculture trend, even if they didn't quite understand it. Today, collectors see these vans as quirky relics of a time when camping met corporate experimentation. Was it practical? Not really. Was it weird? Absolutely. It proved GM could make a camper van, just not one anyone was rushing to buy. 1964 GM Runabout. Sometimes weird doesn't come from a desire to go faster or look cooler. It comes from trying to solve a problem nobody really asked to solve. Case in point, the 1964 GM Runabout. This little 3-seat concept was designed as a housewife's car, a phrase that already feels stuck in another century. The Runabout looked like a compact commuter pod with 2 rear seats and a driver's seat up front. But the truly bizarre feature was its front end. Instead of a normal trunk or engine bay, it had built-in shopping baskets. Yes, baskets. The idea was that a woman could drive to the store, fill the detachable baskets with groceries, clip them back into place, and head home with no fuss. GM engineers even claimed it would save time and make errands more convenient. On paper, it almost sounds clever. In reality, it was a design that underestimated how much people buy at the store. Those baskets couldn't hold more than a few bags, and they were awkward to remove when full. Add in the Runabout's cartoonish styling, tiny size, and total lack of horsepower, and you had a car that seemed better suited for scooting around a parking lot than braving real roads. The Runabout never made it past the concept stage, but it's remembered as one of GM's strangest attempts at targeting a demographic. Instead of solving real needs, it leaned on stereotypes and gimmicks. Still, as a snapshot of 1960s optimism and corporate cluelessness, it's an unforgettable piece of GM weirdness. 1966, Oldsmobile Toronado. At first glance, you might think the Oldsmobile Toronado doesn't belong on a list of weird GM cars. After all, it was stylish, muscular, and even considered a design icon. But here's why it earns its spot. The Toronado was the first American front-wheel drive car in decades, and the way GM pulled it off was both brilliant and bizarre. Underneath its sleek body, the Toronado hid an engineering experiment that turned Detroit tradition upside down. Instead of sending power to the rear wheels, like every other muscle-bound car of the era, GM flipped the script. They mounted a massive 425 cubic inch V8 sideways and fed its fury to the front wheels through a chain-driven transmission called the THM 425. Yes, a literal chain was transferring power from that monster engine to the wheels. The setup worked, sort of. The Toronado delivered surprising traction in poor weather and handled better than its size suggested. But when you floored it, torque steer yanked the steering wheel out of your hands like a wrestling match. Enthusiasts loved the novelty, but mechanics cursed the complexity. That chain-drive transmission became a notorious maintenance headache, especially as the miles piled on. Despite its quirks, the Toronado was a hit, proving that weird ideas could still succeed in the marketplace. It inspired other GM divisions to experiment with front-wheel drive, eventually shaping much of the company's lineup. Today, the Toronado stands out as a car that blended elegance with downright oddball engineering. It was both revolutionary and ridiculous, and that's exactly why it belongs here. 1969. Chevrolet Astro III. If you thought GM's Firebird concepts were wild, wait until you see the Astro III. This wasn't just a weird car. It looked like it belonged in a Jetsons cartoon. With 3 wheels, a bullet-shaped body, and a turbine engine in the back, the Astro III was less a car and more a rolling science project. The cockpit was a clear bubble canopy that slid open to reveal 2 seats positioned fighter jet style, with the passenger sitting directly behind the driver. Controls were aviation-inspired, and the whole thing screamed personal spaceship. It wasn't meant to be practical. It was designed to make people's jaws drop at auto shows. And on that front, it succeeded spectacularly. Power came from a gas turbine engine, the same kind GM had been playing with in its Firebird experiments. While the turbine promised smooth, high-speed power, it was wildly impractical for everyday driving. Fuel economy was terrible. Heat management was a nightmare, and maintenance costs were astronomical. GM knew full well it wasn't going to mass-produce the Astro III, but that wasn't the point. The Astro III reflected an era when car companies thought the future of driving might actually look like aviation. It wasn't about selling cars. It was about selling dreams, even if those dreams were a little crazy. Looking back, the Astro III is a perfect example of GM at its most imaginative and most impractical all at once. 1970 Chevrolet Corvette XP882. What's weirder than a Corvette with a roaring V8? How about a Corvette with a rotary engine? That was GM's idea in 1970 with the XP882, a prototype that stuffed not 1, but 4 rotary chambers under the hood. The goal? To create a futuristic Corvette that broke free from tradition while keeping performance at the forefront. Rotary engines were the hot new thing at the time, thanks to Mazda's Wankel-powered cars. General Motors thought it could do the same, only bigger and better. The XP882 was sleek, low-slung, and packed with innovation. But under the hood, things weren't so rosy. Rotary engines were notoriously thirsty, fragile, and tough to keep cool. Multiply those problems by 4, and you had a ticking time bomb disguised as a sports car. Engineers struggled to make the XP882 reliable, and when the oil crisis hit in the 1970s, the idea of a gas-guzzling experimental engine was dead on arrival. GM shelved the project, and the Corvette stayed faithful to its V8 roots. Still, the fact that they even considered selling a rotary Corvette is mind-blowing. Today, the XP882 is remembered as a tantalizing what-if moment in Corvette history. It's one of the weirdest experiments GM ever dared to try, and while it never reached showrooms, it proved that even icons like the Corvette weren't safe from the wilder impulses of Detroit engineering. 1977 Pontiac Phantom. If the Aerovette was GM looking to the future, the Pontiac Phantom was GM staring too hard into the past. Created by designer Bill Mitchell as a personal swan song, the Phantom was supposed to be a tribute to Pontiac's performance heritage. Instead, it looked like a boxy relic from another era, outdated the moment it rolled out of the studio. The Phantom was a 2-door coupe with exaggerated fenders, upright styling, and a front end that looked more like a neoclassical throwback than a modern sports car. It was supposed to channel Pontiac's glory days of muscle and power, but instead, it came off like a costume party version of a performance car. Even Mitchell himself admitted the Phantom was more about style experiments than practicality. Underneath, the Phantom was less revolutionary than evolutionary. It was built on existing Pontiac architecture and didn't bring much new to the table. GM never intended to produce it, but it still turned heads for all the wrong reasons. Some called it bold, others called it embarrassing, but nobody called it cutting edge. The Phantom stands out as weird, not because it was futuristic, but because it was oddly nostalgic in a decade where car buyers wanted fresh ideas. It was a concept car stuck between eras, a misfire that showed even GM's best designers weren't immune to getting lost in their own visions. 1981 Cadillac Seville Bustleback. Some cars make you wonder, what were they thinking? The 1981 Cadillac Seville Bustleback falls squarely into that category. In an attempt to inject European flair into Cadillac's lineup, GM designers grafted a chopped-off trunk onto the Seville, creating a bustleback rear end that looked more like a failed facelift than a luxury upgrade. The idea was to mimic the classic coach-built cars of the 1930s, which featured upright trunks for elegance. The problem? By 1981, nobody wanted their luxury sedan to look like a horse-drawn carriage. The bustleback design made the Seville appear stubby and awkward, earning it more puzzled stares than admiration. Mechanically, the car didn't help its case. Cadillac saddled the Seville with unreliable diesel engines and electronics that were far from dependable. Owners didn't just get strange looks from neighbors, they got tow trucks too. While some buyers were intrigued by the different styling, most simply avoided it, and the bustleback experiment fizzled out by the mid-1880s. Today, the bustleback Seville is remembered as one of Cadillac's weirdest detours. It tried to capture old-world charm, but ended up looking dated and pretentious. For a brand that prided itself on being the standard of the world, this was a stumble that left everyone scratching their heads. 1990, General Motors Lean Machine. The Lean Machine sounds like the name of a workout fad, but it was actually one of GM's strangest creations. Picture a three-wheeled pod that leaned into corners like a motorcycle, but was enclosed like a car. That was GM's idea of the future in 1990. The Lean Machine was designed for efficiency. It weighed just 600 pounds, had a small one-cylinder engine, and could hit nearly 80 miles per gallon. On paper, it was exactly the kind of fuel-sipping vehicle GM needed to respond to growing concerns about gas prices. But in practice, it looked more like a carnival ride than a commuter car. Its tilting suspension allowed it to lean dramatically into turns, giving drivers a motorcycle-like experience without the exposure to the elements. Sounds cool, right? Except most people didn't want their car to act like a roller coaster. The Lean Machine also had zero cargo space, limited passenger room, and looked about as safe as riding inside a soda can. GM never intended to mass-produce the Lean Machine, but it showcased how far the company was willing to stretch in pursuit of efficiency. Today, it stands as a quirky reminder that not every future car idea was destined to catch on. Fun to look at? Yes. Fun to drive? Maybe. A practical replacement for the family sedan? Not even close. 2002 Cadillac Cien. If you think Cadillac is all about retirees and soft luxury, the Cien will blow your mind. Unveiled in 2002 to celebrate Cadillac's 100th anniversary, the Cien was a futuristic supercar concept that looked more like a stealth fighter than a sedan. The name Cien meant 100 in Spanish, and it was Cadillac's way of saying, we can do exotic too. With sharp edges, scissor doors, and a mid-mounted 7.5-liter V12 engine producing 750 horsepower, the Cien was a jaw-dropping spectacle. It was featured in movies, video games, and magazine covers, instantly becoming one of the most famous concept cars GM ever made. But here's the kicker, it never went into production. The early 2000s weren't kind to GM's finances, and building a hand-built V12 exotic wasn't exactly in the budget. So the Cien remained a one-off showpiece, a tantalizing glimpse of what Cadillac could have been if money wasn't an issue. Today, the Cien is remembered as one of GM's most spectacularly weird experiments, not because it was ugly or flawed, but because it was so out of character for Cadillac. It proved the brand could dream big, even if those dreams never made it to the showroom. From jet-powered road rockets to tilting three-wheelers and bustleback luxury sedans, GM has proven time and again that weirdness isn't a bug, it's a feature. Some of these cars influenced future designs, others crashed and burned. But every single one left an unforgettable mark. Which of these oddball machines blew your mind the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and buckle up. Because automotive history is always stranger than fiction.